became with a Lifelong Learning Institute member, there's all sorts of information out front that you could learn about our programs. We have a big open house coming up on January 7th through 10th. And it's a wonderful program. If someone got you here, the chances are you know how wonderful it is because they've talked your ear off. So this is not my show other than hosting it, so I'm going to introduce you. He's not the vice mayor anymore. I've been mistaken. He's the mayor of, what is it, Fort Lauderdale, Broward County? Broward County. He's the mayor of everything. So if you have any complaints, this is not the day to do it because you've done us a wonderful thing. Our garbage is being picked up, everything else is fine. But he's here because he's bringing us this wonderful gentleman who many of you were fortunate enough to hear back in January of 2017. But a lot has changed. He said, don't sit down, I'm going to turn it over to you. Just be really, really loud, and then the AV people will hopefully get down here quick enough.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Mark Bogan, and I have the honor today. I'm just going to introduce a gentleman. Let me give you a real quick background. He graduated from Moscow Linguistic University, worked at the United Nations in the 70s as a translator, worked at the Soviet Foreign Ministry from 1980 to 1991. He participated in every U.S.-Soviet summit from 1985 to 91 that involved President Gorbachev, President Reagan, President Bush. He dealt with everybody. You'll see pictures of him standing right there in all the meetings, which is incredible involvement. He currently is working with the Gorbachev Foundation. He's an advisor to President Gorbachev for international relations. Speaks all over Atlantic Council, the Brookings Institute, Johns Hopkins. He was just at Duke. He's an incredible individual, a great guy. I'd like to introduce to you Pavel Pelchenko.
Okay, no problem. Okay, thank you very much, and it's good to be here. This is my second time to this school. I enjoyed it last time. I hope those who were in the audience also enjoyed it, and I hope you will enjoy it today. So, I am here, frankly, at a time when relations between my country and the United States are in real bad shape. It's a dismal relationship that our two nations cannot afford, must not permit, must do everything possible to change for the better. And I think that given this extremely difficult situation, recalling the experience of the 1980s, when we turned around the Cold War, when we reversed the period of confrontation, the period of Cold War, and moved toward partnership and cooperation, I think this is really of enormous importance. And I will try to recall that experience because I was witness and participant in those years of this amazing turnaround in relations between our two nations. This, by the way, is the last picture of President Gorbachev and President Bush and Secretary of State Baker when they last met in Houston in 2012. I think that all of you probably watched a lot of TV over these past days associated with President Bush after his passing. And I must say that when I published on Facebook some of those pictures, there were dozens and hundreds of people who liked it, who paid their respects, because there is a kind of nostalgia for that time, a kind of nostalgia for the statesmanship, for the achievements, for the miraculous end of the Cold War that happened basically without a single shot fired, and that ended on mutually acceptable terms with agreements to eliminate and destroy thousands of nuclear weapons, both strategic nuclear weapons, intermediate range nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, a process started during that time that has led to now both sides having a fraction, perhaps 1/5, less than 1/5 of the numbers of nuclear weapons that existed at the height of the Cold War. Just again, to repeat the magnitude of that achievement, 85% of the nuclear weapons that existed at the height of the Cold War have now been eliminated, practically all of them destroyed, some of them in what is called central storage, so basically not on alert, not threatening the possible annihilation as a result of their use in some kind of conflict. Our two countries still have enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization. And that is why, as I said, we cannot afford the current state of relations. Going back, relations were not much better. Perhaps they were even worse when President Reagan and President Gorbachev, at that time General Secretary Gorbachev, met for the first time in Geneva in November 1985. So this is a photograph of them meeting in the Soviet mission, the Soviet UN mission in Geneva. Was it difficult to even organize that meeting? Yes, it was. Nevertheless, we had a situation where I would say less than 6 months after Gorbachev became General Secretary, they were able to get together for a substantive meeting. So in contrast to the current situation where a really substantive summit between Presidents Putin and Trump has not yet happened, they were able to come together within 6 months of when Gorbachev became the Soviet leader. So that was in and of itself, I would say, a very significant achievement. It happened because on both sides there was understanding of the need to normalize relations, to start putting those relations back on track. There were many differences in both sides' approach to that meeting. For example, the Soviet side suggested from the start that the first summit between Gorbachev and Reagan should end with a joint statement that would outline the issues that they discussed, that would also outline areas of agreement and prospects for continued dialogue and engagement. This was our plan, but initially it was rejected by the State Department, by the US side, because they felt that such joint statements are not particularly substantive, that they are long, they mostly consist of rhetoric, and they do not really advance the solution of the issues between the two sides. That was their position. So we come to Geneva, it was November 1985, and at some point President Gorbachev suggests to President Reagan, why don't you consider the possibility of a joint statement? Your State Department has told our people that a joint statement is just rhetoric, that it's not particularly productive in terms of solving the issues. What do you think, Mr. President? And the kind of person that Reagan was, he could very easily overrule his own people if he felt like it, if he felt that something useful can be done. He wouldn't overrule them on the really substantive issues. There was a process, both within the Soviet Union and within the United States, where various government agencies developed positions on the important issues such as arms control, regional conflicts, etc. But on protocol, on procedure, on things like a joint statement, Reagan was his own man. And to my surprise, Reagan said, yes, this is a good idea. Let us get our people to work on a joint statement, and let's see what they come up with. And if I feel that I can approve such a joint statement, I'm happy to do it. The interesting thing that happened, they worked overnight on that joint statement. There was a working group that consisted of Soviet and American diplomats. They worked on that joint statement. And at some point, it was suggested that a phrase from one of President Reagan's speeches come into that joint statement. That phrase became famous when it became part of the joint statement of Gorbachev and Reagan. And that phrase still reverberates. It's one sentence saying, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." It was Reagan's phrase, but it also reflected Gorbachev's thinking and Gorbachev's position, and generally the official position of both governments was that we don't want nuclear war, we are for nuclear disarmament, but it was never expressed so vividly in such language in a joint statement. It also was followed by another statement, by another phrase that I think we might we should remember and recall today. The two sides will not seek military superiority. They will not seek military superiority. Nuclear war cannot be won, it must never be fought, and we will not seek military superiority. A very important phrase that again became a part of the joint statement of Gorbachev and Reagan in Geneva in November 1985. And words matter. It's not just rhetoric. If both leaders believe that a nuclear war is unacceptable, then why continue the arms race? And when the statement was published, and it included a lot of other provisions, a lot of other areas of agreement, a lot of other areas of possible cooperation, including things like people-to-people contacts, like cooperation in education, healthcare. All of those goals were set out in that agreement. And it created something that the media called the Spirit of Geneva. There was a new spirit in relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. A new spirit 6 years after their previous meeting, the meeting between Brezhnev and Jimmy Carter in Geneva in 1979. After that, there wasn't a single summit between the USSR and the USA. So that was the first summit after 6 years of really, really intensive Cold War. So that created a new spirit of Geneva. But did things just go smoothly and swimmingly after that? Is it enough to just set those goals? No, it's not enough. And relations continued to be bumpy for quite a few years. For 2 or 3 years, we had difficulty translating that spirit into agreements and into a real improvement in relations between our countries. So when today some people say that, it was a relatively easy process, the Soviet Union was making the concessions and the United States was pocketing those concessions, it was a one-sided process, and the Cold War ended because the United States either outsmarted or waited out the Soviet Union, and that's how the Cold War came to an end. That is totally wrong. The Cold War came to an end because we worked on it, because we worked on specific arms reduction agreements, and because in the process of working on arms reduction, working on ending the regional conflicts, such as Afghanistan, such as Cambodia, such as Angola and Southern Africa, such as Nicaragua, all of those conflicts where the Soviet Union and the United States were on the opposite sides of the conflict. And in the process of working on that, a difficult process that had its ups and downs. We were building trust. Some people would say that trust is something on which you cannot rely, that trust is something that is perhaps ephemeral, that is perhaps naive. This is what many people are saying, and they say it's not trust. We just need to develop certain agreements, areas of agreements, and verify those agreements. Trust is unimportant. That is not the case. Without this important element of trust, which is gradual, which emerges in the process of working on those issues, on those agreements, without trust, I think long-term relations cannot be constructive, cannot be good. So we worked on building trust in a step-by-step, gradual way. Reagan and Gorbachev, as I said, shared abhorrence of nuclear weapons, abhorrence of weapons of mass destruction. It is what I think brought them together despite the enormous differences in their own personalities, but also differences in the positions that they defended on various issues. Those positions were sometimes very far apart. There were also other things that could have perhaps scuttled the relationship and their efforts to put an end to the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. Relations between the Soviet Union and the United States are always very complicated, always very complex. And things like spy scandals happened, not one, but several. There were scandals related to the surveillance, to the bugs, listening devices in the buildings of the embassies that our countries have. There were the entry of American naval ships into Soviet territorial waters in the Black Sea. All of these things created real crises. And it is very easy, and it is indeed what happened many times before Gorbachev and Reagan, that such crises, such scandals, such episodes resulted in a breakdown of dialogue, in a breakdown of communication, a breakdown of engagement. This, to their credit, Gorbachev and Reagan didn't allow to happen. Despite such episodes, such incidents, sometimes very unpleasant incidents, there were, for example, mutual expulsions of diplomats. It reminds you probably of what happened recently between our countries. But even though dozens of diplomats were expelled by the Soviet Union and by the United States, again, those leaders had their eyes on the ball, so to say. They did not allow themselves to be distracted from the important work on particularly nuclear arms control. Both of them, as I said, shared abhorrence of nuclear weapons, but also both of them shared a desire to start the process of arms reduction. There was a proposal by President Reagan made 3 or 4 years previous to their first meeting, which was called Zero Option. Zero Option concerned intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe. Those intermediate range nuclear weapons, the missiles with 3 warheads, were deployed by the Soviet Union. In the early 1980s, the United States responded by deploying ballistic and cruise missiles in 5 European countries. When the US government decided to do this program of deployment of intermediate range missiles, Reagan also proposed that he would be ready to remove and destroy those missiles if the Soviet Union were to also destroy the missiles that it had previously deployed in the European part of the Soviet Union. So, initially, Leonid Brezhnev and subsequent Soviet leaders before Gorbachev dismissed that proposal out of hand. They said it will not happen. We need those Soviet missiles for our defense and for the defense of our allies. It is part of our nuclear deterrent. That was the position before Gorbachev. Gorbachev had the courage to accept that proposal. When they met in Reykjavik in October 1986, that is 1 year after, less than 1 year after their first meeting in Geneva, Gorbachev, among other proposals, said that we would be ready to remove and destroy those weapons that were deployed in Europe. So Reagan was faced with the Soviet Union accepting his proposal. But we knew that there were many people in the US government and some US allies who regarded Reagan's proposal as basically a propaganda ploy, as something that was proposed because they knew that Gorbachev would never, that the Soviet Union would never accept that proposal. For their own reasons, those people believed that it's important to have intermediate range missiles in Europe. But that's important for the defense of NATO, of the Western Alliance. And so when Gorbachev accepted that proposal, as Secretary Shultz later recalled, many people were against it. The future National Security Advisor under President Bush, Brent Scowcroft, was against it. He wanted the US to find a way to back out of its own proposal. Henry Kissinger believed that the proposal to remove all intermediate range missiles was not a good idea, that it is bad for the strategic linkage between the United States and Europe. Margaret Thatcher didn't like that proposal. The French President Francois Mitterrand didn't like that proposal. So the question was, will President Reagan stand by his own proposal? And he did. And I can't tell you how important that was, because had he decided to back out of his own proposal using whatever pretext, and there were plenty that were available, that would have undermined the emerging trust between the Soviet Union and the US. President Reagan was an extremely interesting person. I recall him as a very affable person, as a person who one felt really wanted to be liked, who wanted to be cordial, engaging, who never was rude, just like President Bush too. He made statements such as calling the Soviet Union evil empire. But you know what? When he came to Moscow in 1988, he was asked by a British reporter when he was taking a walk on Red Square and in the Kremlin, he was asked by a British reporter whether he still regarded the Soviet Union in 1988 as an evil empire. And without missing a beat, President Reagan said no. That was another time, another era. So he was that kind of person, not someone who would be an expert on every issue, who would know by heart all the numbers of strategic weapons and things like that, but a person who was very genuine. When he said something that we didn't like, we responded. He normally would stand by what he said, but when things changed, he accepted it. He accepted it, and that was a very important statement. Many people believe that that was really the end of the Cold War. And it was the end of the Cold War because not only was this a statement, rhetoric, words, by that time that had been backed up by the numerous agreements that the Soviet Union and the United States had signed, or perhaps not yet signed, but agreed on. The first such agreement was, as I said, the agreement to eliminate all INF, intermediate range missiles. It was signed in December 1987 in Washington. I still vividly remember that signing. I remember as though it happened yesterday, how this was signed after intense negotiations. Some of those negotiations continued even during President Gorbachev's visit in Washington. And those negotiations resulted in the first treaty that totally eliminated that particular class of weapons. All land-based missiles with a range of from 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers were destroyed, and their warheads. All of those missiles. So an enormous achievement. So it's not just words. That was the moment when we saw words being translated into action, into the first reduction of nuclear weapons. Interestingly, the overall number of launchers and warheads that were eliminated amounted to just, I think, 3% of the nuclear arsenals of the Soviet Union and the United States. But at the same time, they also agreed in Reykjavik that there will be a 50% reduction of strategic missiles, land-based, submarine-based, and the bombs of the strategic bombers. That was only ultimately signed and ratified in 1991. Negotiations unfortunately dragged out. President Reagan and Secretary Shultz wanted that to be signed on their watch. It didn't happen because there were people in the US government who wanted to protract those negotiations. So unfortunately, they did go for too long, in my opinion. Under Reagan, just that one agreement was signed. But as I said, the framework for a future strategic weapons agreement was agreed in Reykjavik in '86. That too was a great advance. And also in 1986, even though they could not agree on weapons in space, on the Strategic Defense Initiative, which President Reagan loved, but Gorbachev believed that it could result in an arms race in space. And he said, why should we start an arms race in space when we are ending and reversing the arms race on Earth? So they could not agree on missile defense. But they were able to agree on strategic weapons, and that too was a great achievement. So Reagan came to Moscow in '88. They exchanged ratification papers in 1988. And as I said, Reagan said that he no longer considered the Soviet Union an evil empire. Probably sometime between that visit and the visit of the talks between President Gorbachev and Bush at Malta in 1989, this is where the Cold War basically ended. Our two sides were no longer adversaries. Even though initially President Bush, when he was elected, took what he called a pause for strategic reflection. He wanted to set himself somehow apart from President Reagan. He wanted not to be seen as just someone who continues in the footsteps of President Reagan. And so we did lose some time. There was a kind of loss of momentum in US-Soviet relations during the first months of the Bush presidency. But then Secretary Baker came to Moscow in May 1989, and the talks resumed in earnest. They prepared a meeting in Malta where they agreed on a number of things pertaining to strategic weapons, chemical weapons. They discussed the regional issues, and it was then that Gorbachev said to Bush that the Soviet Union was prepared no longer to regard the United States as an enemy. We are prepared to no longer regard the United States as an enemy. We are prepared, he said, to state so publicly. And so this important exchange, and Bush welcomed it, and he said, the enemy is not the other side. The enemy is the instability and unpredictability that we see in the world today, which is so rapidly changing. So it was an enormously important exchange of mutual assurances that our two countries were no longer enemies. However, as I said, unfortunately, the final treaty on strategic weapons was only signed in 1991 during Reagan's visit to Moscow. Between Malta and Reagan's visit to Moscow in 1991 were events of enormous importance in Eastern Europe. There were velvet revolutions where the people of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, then Romania and Bulgaria toppled the communist governments. And that transition from a one-party rule, communist party rule, to democracy happened practically without bloodshed. With the exception of Romania, in all of those countries, it happened without bloodshed. So the Soviet Union did not intervene, as Gorbachev had promised, did not intervene in those developments, even though at that time the Soviet Union had thousands of soldiers stationed in those countries, and of course, German unification. In 1989, the people of East Germany started to protest and to demonstrate in the streets. The population of East Germany at that time was 16 million people. Of those people, hundreds of thousands, probably millions, were in the streets protesting and demanding unification. That faced the Soviet leadership with a question, how to respond to that. And Gorbachev, from the very start, pledged that we will not use force in order to stop that process. The process of democratic transition in Eastern Europe and the process of German unification. Do you think it was easy for him to take that decision? Not easy. Remember, the German unification process started just 40 years after the war. After the war, during which, the Soviet Union lost over 20 million people. The war that was started by Hitler. And for the Soviet Union, East Germany, the so-called German Democratic Republic, was a kind of bulwark, a kind of assurance that war would not again come to Russia from German territory. Many Soviet people thought so. And so, emotionally, psychologically, historically, it was not really easy to accept that. Again, people like Margaret Thatcher, François Mitterrand, the Italian leaders, thought that German unification was not such a good idea. They did not openly protest it. They did not openly say that they would prefer Germany to continue to be divided. But that was the subtext of their positions. They really didn't want it. But they expected that perhaps Gorbachev would try to stop that process. Again, without saying that publicly. So it took enormous courage for Gorbachev to refuse to intervene, to refuse to in any way try to stop the process, either in Eastern Europe and particularly in Germany. And that was a big test for the new relationship between the Soviet Union and the West. When the Berlin Wall fell, both sides, the Soviet Union, but also, I must say, the United States, led by the late President Bush, took a very careful, cautious, moderate, restrained approach that favored the process of unification that took place a lot more rapidly than anyone expected. I can assure you, even in the United States, even in the Bush administration, no one expected that process to go so fast. And it's always very difficult to act in situations when things are developing faster than you expect. So it took enormous statesmanship and restraint on the part of both sides to put that process on a peaceful track, to make sure that it remains peaceful. And to the great credit of the leaders of that time, that indeed was the case. It was a peaceful process from beginning to end, to the moment when the unification was over and the treaty on the final settlement with regard to Germany was signed. It was signed in Moscow in 1990. As I said, an enormous achievement that signified that the Cold War was indeed over. Then another test came, another test, a difficult test. You may remember it. That was the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein. In the past, any similar situation would have resulted in the Soviet Union and the United States being on the opposite sides of the battle, because the Soviet Union had a treaty with Iraq on friendship and cooperation. A treaty signed under Leonid Brezhnev. The other side that signed was Saddam Hussein himself. And that treaty assumed that we were, if not allies, but certainly partners. So the Soviet Union was supposed to react in a situation of crisis or conflict on the Iraqi side. But that did not happen. Fortunately, that did not happen because Gorbachev and the entire Soviet leadership stated that they could not accept the fact when one country invades another country and basically absorbs it, so that that country, as Saddam Hussein stated, no longer existed. When Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait, within less than a day, they had the whole country occupied. Kuwait didn't resist, and they had very little with which they could resist. So what happens next? Bush and other Western governments decided that the forces of Iraq must be expelled from Kuwait. So they make a statement that Saddam Hussein should leave and withdraw immediately. The Soviet Union, once again, despite the fact that we had that treaty, despite the fact that we had hundreds of Soviet citizens in Iraq working on various cooperation projects, including, by the way, defense cooperation projects. Despite that, the Soviet Union supported that demand. There was the UN Security Council resolution demanding that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait. The resolution was adopted with the votes of all 15 members of the Security Council, including the Soviet Union and China, which on that particular issue followed the position of the Soviet Union. For the first time in years and decades, a regional conflict did not put the Soviet Union and the US on the opposite sides of the barricades, as they say, on the opposite side of the conflict, the opposite side of the issue. It is very important that, unlike some subsequent presidents, Bush decided to act through the UN Security Council, not by unilaterally giving an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein, but by making this the position of the entire international community. And when it became clear that Saddam Hussein doesn't intend to comply with that resolution, and when Bush used force against Iraq, that too was authorized by the UN Security Council. An extremely important example of cooperation instead of unilateral action by the United States or by the Western Alliance. Gorbachev believed and negotiated, actually, with the Iraqis that after the air campaign began against the Iraqi troops and against Iraq more generally, to force Iraq out of Kuwait, Gorbachev believed that nevertheless a ground invasion of Kuwait by the huge American force that had been concentrated in the proximity of Kuwait, that invasion or that military ground campaign could have been avoided. He negotiated until the very end, until the moment when when boots were on the ground, so to say, when American boots were on the ground. He negotiated with the Iraqi foreign minister, persuading them to leave, because he said, you have no other option. You'll have to leave. Americans are ready to actually use ground forces to expel you from Kuwait. Unfortunately, that did not happen until the very end. We were hoping. I participated in some of those negotiations. I participated in some of the telephone calls because Gorbachev informed President Bush about what was happening. Unfortunately, they did not leave, so they had to be expelled by the American ground force that entered the territory of Kuwait and very quickly swept the Iraqi forces away from Kuwait. But what happened? They stopped at the border of Iraq. The American forces, NATO forces that participated in that campaign did not occupy Iraq. There was no occupation, no regime change. They acted in accordance with the UN resolution, which was about withdrawing from Kuwait and which did not authorize any occupation of Iraq. It was a very statesmanlike decision by President Bush, and I believe that the process of cooperation with the Soviet Union in the UN and generally the common stand that they took played an important role in his decision not to go all the way to Baghdad, not to occupy Iraq, not to force the change of regime in Iraq. Very different from the position that his son took 12 years later. Very different. So those two big tests of the new relationship, of the end of the Cold War, succeeded in showing that we were in new territory, that we no longer were adversaries or enemies. We were in the beginning of the post-Cold War era. The Soviet Union broke up for reasons that were internal, that were domestic, rather than any foreign intervention or foreign influence. You know, now many people in the former Soviet Union, particularly in Russia, tend to blame the United States and the West for the breakup of the Soviet Union. I strongly disagree with that position. That is not the case. The process of rebuilding the country, the process of perestroika, brought out many problems that had existed in the Soviet Union before. Most of those republics wanted to become more autonomous. Most of those republics wanted to have control of their own economy. Gorbachev believed that there should be a new treaty between the republics, a new form of association between the republics, but they should stay together because it is better for economic reform, it is better also for the human rights situation when the republics are united by a certain constitution, by certain obligations in areas, as I said, such as the economy, human rights, cooperation, infrastructure, defense. He saw that there were areas where republics should continue to work together. That was not the view of Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia. That was not the view of the leaders of Ukraine and other republics. And ultimately, against the wishes of President Gorbachev, they decided, so to say, to go their own way. But it was, as I said, an internal decision, a domestic political situation that went against the wishes of Gorbachev, but it certainly was not provoked or in any way fueled by Bush or by other Western leaders. As Bush promised Gorbachev at Malta 2 years previously, he treaded carefully. That was his phrase. I will tread carefully. And he did. He did. He actually made a speech in Kiev where he warned against the possible negative consequences of the uncontrolled breakup of the country. As I said, unfortunately, following the attempted coup against Gorbachev, the attempted coup d'etat against Gorbachev in August 1991, Gorbachev's position as president of the Soviet Union was weakened. Yeltsin, who resisted that coup, became stronger. So ultimately, Yeltsin imposed his own solution, which was the breakup of the Soviet Union. But as I said, it's important to remember that the Cold War had ended long before that happened. It is not correct to confuse and conflate the end of the Soviet Union as a country and the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War is something that happened as a result of our common efforts, as a result of very difficult negotiations, as a result of ending the nuclear arms race, as a result of the beginning of the actual nuclear disarmament. That is what happened. That is what ended the Cold War. To the great credit of the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States and other countries as well. So what are the lessons that we can draw from that in the current extremely difficult situation in relations between our nations, between Russia and the West, and in particular the United States? I think the first lesson is that things were no easier when we started the process of negotiations in '85. What we're facing today is a terrible situation, a lot of mutual mistrust, a lot of mutual accusations, a lot of issues that divide our countries. But as I say, it was not easier in '85. So we should understand that problems like what we're facing today existed. They were overcome. We can overcome current problems if we put our minds to it. And we have the example 30 years ago of what can be done to resolve the difficult issues in relations. The second lesson, which is closely related to the first one, is that all kinds of stuff happens. A lot of stuff happens. This is not what we are watching now, is not the first scandal, is not the first incident, is not the first expulsion, is not the first spy situations that our nations have faced. We were able to, in similar situations, exercise restraint, to engage, to talk, to work things out, and to move on. So that's the second lesson. Stuff happens, but we can move on. We can find a way of continuing engagement and dialogue despite that stuff. What's the third lesson? I think, frankly, this is not often mentioned. The third lesson is the centrality of arms control, the centrality of negotiations on weapons, particularly nuclear weapons. This is what I think both Reagan and Gorbachev understood. This is what President Bush understood very well. If we are able to move forward on arms control, on reducing nuclear arms, then the atmosphere changes. There is more trust. Remember, soon after the signing of the first nuclear disarmament agreement in December 1987, the Soviet Union started to withdraw from Afghanistan. Two issues that basically were not related. But the fact that we were able to agree on such a difficult issue as intermediate range nuclear forces created a new situation. More trust emerged, and based on that, the Soviet Union finally started the process of withdrawal from Afghanistan. Some people keep saying that, well, the Soviet Union spent so many years in Afghanistan, etc. And it did look like a very long presence. But now we know it was just 10 years, a long time. But look at what's happening now. And it's not the Soviet Union that is in Afghanistan. So it's difficult. It's not easy to, again, take that decision. But what I mean by centrality of arms control is that when you agree on arms control, things tend to begin to get better on other issues as well. So when people tell me today that, we have this terrible thing with the accusations of meddling in the elections, the current investigation that will keep revealing all kinds of things, etc., etc., I tell them, we were facing a situation when, at that time, Afghanistan was draining, our resources, and frankly, a lot of it was the result of the fact that the United States was supporting the other side, the Mujahideen, the so-called Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, whom I think we now tend to call terrorists, right? So anyway, things can be very difficult, but let us not link the areas such as cooperation in reducing nuclear weapons, cooperation against terrorism, developing a foundation of economic relations, trade, and things like that. Let us not link that with the issues that perhaps will be resolved one day when the overall situation improves. But let's start improving the overall situation. And then the time will come when I think we can have a dialogue about everything, including the most severe things that look like hopeless today. So that's the third lesson, centrality of arms control. There are still enough weapons in the arsenals of the United States and Russia to destroy the world. Let's start moving on that. Let's see how it goes. Putin has said that all those new Russian weapons are up for negotiations. We can negotiate them. We don't want a new arms race. Trump, he has said many things, but most recently, he has said that he doesn't want an arms race. He said the kind of budget that we have today for weapons is crazy. Well, let's sit down and discuss all those weapons. So I believe that that could definitely improve the overall atmosphere. And finally, the fourth lesson is the value of broad-based dialogue, not just the official dialogue. We should have our people more in contact, more in touch, more exchanges. This has almost been forgotten. One of the first agreements that Gorbachev and Reagan agreed on was the enlargement, the expansion of people-to-people contacts, of mutual visits, of education exchanges, young people. I think that whatever divides us now should not be an obstacle to such exchanges. It's interesting that last year there were more American tourists in Russia, twice as many as the year before. So people want to visit, people want exchanges, people want dialogue. So let us create more opportunities, particularly for young people. So dialogue should be broad-based, not just the official dialogue, but also people to people, and very importantly, experts, academics, they have good ideas. We saw that in the 80s when we negotiated. Gorbachev trusted his academic and scientific advisors. I would say the same about the American government, and we were able to achieve a lot with their help. Very frankly, I don't expect things to improve significantly in the coming months or perhaps a couple of years, but that is a good time for our experts, for our academics, for former diplomats, retired military, to start getting together. That would definitely be my proposal. They should start getting together. You may be interested in a joint op-ed signed by George Shultz and Mikhail Gorbachev a couple of days ago in the Washington Post. And they're suggesting the creation of an informal forum or working group in which US and Russian experts could discuss ideas for arms control in particular, for strategic stability, things like issues like cybersecurity, like weapons of third countries, how to put arms control back on track. Even if nothing much happens on an official level in the coming months or years, that could create groundwork that could then be proposed to our leaders, and once the political situation improves, they could perhaps quickly come to very constructive agreements and treaties and sign those treaties. So the fourth lesson is dialogue that should be broad-based, that should include not only the leaders and diplomats, but also academics, experts, ordinary people, educational exchanges. That work quite well, and that I think can work again. So I tried to describe what happened. I tried to make some suggestions about what we should do in the current dismal situation. I am not naive. I understand that it will take time. But let me conclude by saying that I believe in the future of US-Russian relations. When we read the newspapers, when we turn on the TV and see all, the news and all the negative talk that we hear, one can despair. But I think we shouldn't. I am gradually moving closer to the age of most of you, and so I have years and decades behind me, and they show and they demonstrate, I think those years demonstrate that it's never hopeless, never say never, and hope and believe and be confident that better days and better years in our relations are to come. I think that both the people of Russia and the people of the United States want that, and I think it will happen. Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other pictures. This is Reykjavik. As you know, because Gorbachev and Reagan were not able to reach agreement on SDI, on the Strategic Defense Initiative, all the other agreements that they had were not signed. And Reagan was really upset. He really was. And the initial assessment, both of Reagan and of Secretary Shultz, was we failed. It was a failure. And this is seen in this picture. Gorbachev, however, characterized Reykjavik as a big breakthrough because we agreed on so many other things. So this is a picture that in a way reflects that. This is Reagan and Gorbachev exchanging their pens after they exchanged the ratification documents on the INF Treaty in Moscow. The second day of their talks, and then they took that walk in the Kremlin and Red Square, and a few minutes later, Reagan said, "No, I no longer regard the Soviet Union as an evil empire." This is at the White House in, no, this is Reykjavik. This is also Reykjavik. the beginning of the talks in Reykjavik. They would then proceed to this room where the two of them and then the four of them, including their foreign minister, Shevardnadze and Schulz, where they continued those negotiations. This is another one, and that is some ceremony, I think, that was related to this is Nathan Sharansky, who was not allowed to leave the Soviet Union for many years. It was not the result of some pressure from Reagan. It was the sovereign decision of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet government, to allow those Jewish people who wanted to leave the Soviet Union to do so, and that process started in early 1989. So, and it started actually in 88, and as I said, it was something that the Soviet Union did as part of perestroika, when we accepted human rights, including the right to emigrate, including, of course, many other rights, such as freedom of speech, such as freedom of association, assembly, etc. That's an interesting one. To whom are they showing their watches? To their wives, because they were taking a tour of the White House and they were late. They were late, like 10 minutes late. This is a really famous one, the meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan, exactly 30 years ago, December 1988. Reagan is president, Bush is president-elect. So Gorbachev comes to Governor's Island after his famous UN speech, in which he outlined the program of arms control, the reduction of Soviet troops, the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Eastern Europe, and their picture, they now call that sometimes family pictures, against the backdrop of the Statue of Liberty. Another one, probably the best one from that particular meeting. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and we have time for Q&A. Yeah.
I got two questions for you. How much do you feel that sense of humor between Gorbachev and Reagan and Bush had to do with any sort of agreement? Their personal relationship with each other, how important was that?
The personal rapport is really important. And one lesson is that you have to work on that personal rapport. Initially, you know, the way Reagan expressed his sense of humor through jokes, through stories, that was not something that Gorbachev initially liked very much, because his sense of humor is very different. It's a reactive sense of humor. He reacts to things not by having a joke ready for that situation, but by a funny phrase or something, and it's a very different kind of interaction. But they learned, and as I said, the relationship between the two nations was bumpy, but the relationship between the two persons was also very bumpy. Yeah, and the lesson is that you really have to work on that. You have to understand that the other side is represented by human beings. Human beings with their flaws, but also with their nice and bright side. I think that what we all liked, you know, the very first time I saw President Reagan was in September 1985, when the foreign minister, Shevardnadze, came to New York for the session of the UN General Assembly. And that was a regular visit, and Reagan invited him to the White House, and they spent about an hour together. I interpreted that meeting. It went quite well, and I saw that Reagan was an excellent host. that he was eager to please the guest, that he was never rude, and that, frankly, I liked a lot more than the jokes. Not because jokes are normally very difficult to translate, but I just thought that that's not the way humor works in our country. So you work on that, and they came to like each other. I mean, when they met years later in 1992, when they met at Reagan's ranch in Simi Valley near Los Angeles, when Gorbachev and Reagan were both private citizens, and even before that, in 1990, when Gorbachev came on a state visit and George Bush was present, they met, Gorbachev and Reagan met in San Francisco. So both in San Francisco in 1990 and also in Simi Valley in 1992, they really met as friends. And again, despite some bumpy episodes between Nancy and Raisa, which the media liked to write about, they really were extremely friendly when they met afterwards. When I remember when Nancy Reagan was asked why initially the relationship with Raisa was not working out, she said it was because both of us were extremely self-conscious. Yeah, they wanted to help their husbands, but they were nervous. I think it's just simpler even than self-conscious. They were nervous and it didn't work initially, but they worked on that. And they helped their husbands, I think, in a big way. So that's how it is.
Tell me something, does Gorbachev still have
Gorbachev's relationship with Putin is, I would say, mixed. Why is that? Gorbachev very much appreciated Putin's first and second presidential terms because he put Russia back on track. Putin inherited Russia from Yeltsin in really bad shape. The economy was in bad shape. The overall situation politically was difficult. There was a real risk that not just Chechnya, but some of the other parts of Russia would begin to separate from Russia, so that would be the continuation of the breakdown. Putin was able to stabilize the situation, and Gorbachev appreciated that. Gorbachev also helped Putin to start the relationship with the second President Bush, because he met George W. Bush even before Putin met him. He was here in the US on a lecture tour, and a meeting was arranged at the White House between Gorbachev and President Bush. So when Gorbachev came back, he reported to Putin what happened and what he felt about Bush and about the prospects for relations. So that was a period when the relationship went rather well. Then later, you know that for one presidential term, we had a different president, President Medvedev. And Gorbachev, very frankly, was in favor of Medvedev continuing and running for a second presidential term, whereas Putin and Medvedev decided that that was not to be. Putin returned as president for a 6-year presidential term. And even though Gorbachev at that time had generally a rather positive attitude toward Putin, he didn't like the fact that this was becoming, this sequence of presidencies for one person. He believes in rotation, in the presidents serving their terms and then, giving way to the next one. He believes that this is an important part of democracy. And when he said that, I don't know, either Putin or perhaps some people close to him didn't like it, and the relationship soured somewhat. So it's, as I said, all of them are human beings. They don't have to love each other. There has to be a political process. But I must say that Putin hasn't caused any problems for Gorbachev in terms of speaking out. Gorbachev is free to speak his mind. The media, including the state media, the government media, interview him. Gorbachev publishes articles in the Russian newspapers. So whatever the relationship, Gorbachev is probably the first example of the leader who is a former leader but who continues to be active, who continues to be part of the political process and of the media. So that's to characterize it, because I mean you cannot answer such questions in just yes or no. Yes, sir.
I remember Reagan saying trust but verify.
Yeah?
Very famous. And lately, it seems like we've lost trust, and it seems as though, at least right now, we're threatening, the United States is threatening from withdrawing from the
Yeah.
nuclear agreement based
Right.
upon arguments that Russia has cheated in some fashion.
Right.
What do you take of all this? What's your perspective on this?
Well, my perspective is that as a result of the INF Treaty and the START Treaty, we had the most elaborate system of verification in history. So yes, trust but verify. We can only repeat that. It's a Russian proverb, by the way. And so I believe that. The problem with the INF Treaty is that the INF Treaty, unlike START, the new START Treaty that was signed by Obama and Medvedev, is in force. It's still in effect. So you can verify so far as strategic weapons are concerned. So far as intermediate range forces are concerned, and that's the treaty from which President Trump wants to withdraw. So far as that treaty is concerned, it has been fully implemented. So there is no official system of verification in place. But there should be a way to verify the US complaints. Unfortunately, both sides, under, in this case, Putin and Obama, Putin and Trump, have not been able to develop some kind of a process, some kind of a mechanism where this is verified through perhaps some kind of a challenge inspection or something. Well, we'll see what happens. It's not a good idea. You know, the withdrawal from this treaty is not a good idea. And I can tell you my own view. It's not a good idea for the United States. I cannot envision a single European country that would want to actually have such missiles on their soil. So let us see what can be done. If you know, push comes to shove and the US does withdraw, at least there should be negotiations to make sure that those weapons that may be produced are not deployed, particularly ballistic missiles, because ballistic missiles have that kind of speed. You know, they can reach Moscow from a European country in 5 to 10 minutes. What's that in terms of decision time for response? It's a terrible thing. And the United States, by the way, when we were negotiating that treaty, had the position that the ballistic missiles are the most destabilizing weapons in the arsenal. So why go back now to producing such destabilizing weapons in the arsenal? Unfortunately, because of the breakdown of trust, we have the breakdown in dialogue. Gorbachev and Schultz, in their recent article in the Washington Post, again, I would urge you to take a look at it, have proposed some kind of a negotiating process to fix the INF Treaty. Not to abandon it, but to fix it, to see what needs to be clarified. There is still time, you know, we'll see. Yes?
Could you comment on the effect that you feel that Bolton will have, or maybe would like to have, on relations between our two countries?
Well, since I do not represent the government, I can give you my personal opinion. This office that Bolton has, that is his dream come true. Because he's always been against any kind of arms control. He's always been in favor of the United States having its hands totally free on any issue, and particularly on what kind of how many weapons the United States wants. This is not the way, you know, things normally work. It is an accepted principle of international relations that there should be negotiations, that if there are issues, you negotiate, you come to some kind of agreement, some kind of compromise. My view is, based on what I hear in the media, based on what I hear what happened during Bolton's visit to Russia a couple of months ago. My feeling is that he doesn't want any of that. So you have that person. He is the third national security advisor for President Trump. As I said, his dream has now come true. How long that paradise will continue for him, we don't know. We'll see. Yes?
Well, thank you for clarifying and explaining the diplomatic undertakings in light of the pending or planned withdrawal from the INF. And I just want to comment, my son is involved in an academic exchange in Kazakhstan, and one of the reasons is because the academic exchanges in Russia have been reduced significantly. Can you talk about the work of the Gorbachev Institute? And you also alluded to the fact that Gorbachev speaks freely. Has there been any position of the Gorbachev Institute or Mr. Gorbachev himself about the activity or the annexation of Crimea and the activity in, I guess, the eastern Ukraine, as well as Russia's support of Syria?
Well, first of all, the Gorbachev Foundation, the Gorbachev Institute, as you called it, is basically a platform for free debate. We have had conferences, both international and Russian conferences, where different opinions were expressed and different opinions were discussed, including on the issues that you mentioned. The position of Gorbachev himself may be different from any of those. So we are not a political party. Gorbachev Foundation is not a political party. We don't have to have a position on everything. But so far as Gorbachev as an individual, as a former president is concerned, as I said, he is often interviewed. He was interviewed multiple times about the Crimea, about the situation in Ukraine, and also about Syria. And that's all easily available on the web. You can Google it, and you will see that, for example, so far as the Crimea is concerned, he emphasizes that whatever happened as a result of the really overwhelming vote of the people of the Crimea who, in a certain situation when there was political turmoil in Ukraine, decided to secede from the Ukrainian state. You can challenge that view, but it's very difficult to actually challenge or dispute the fact that the people of the Crimea, following the breakup of the Soviet Union, always had that dream of returning to Russia. It's a fact. I mean, you can talk about Russia violating international law by helping to organize that referendum. But the referendum happened. And so far as violations of international law is concerned, let me tell you, all major countries have in recent years and decades violated international law. Look at the United States, look at China, look at India, look at even Turkey, France. Yeah, it happened. It happened. And the extent to which it was violated, that can be debated, actually. The fact that not a single drop of blood was shed during the process of Crimea going from Ukraine to Russia, I think that too should be taken into account. My own view about that, yes, there was a violation of international law, and I don't like it, but that's my view. That's my view, and there are not too many people in my country who share that view, frankly, because this is a complicated historical thing. You know, so much blood was shed by Russian soldiers in the 19th century during World War II for the Crimea that, you know, I mean, whatever you say, whatever you think about it, you cannot disregard those historical facts. So it's a difficult one. I fear that, unfortunately, whereas no Russian president can ever contemplate giving the Crimea back to Ukraine, but also no Ukrainian president will ever renounce Ukraine's claim to the Crimea. What does that do? It poisons our relations with Ukraine for years to come. That is another thing. So this is a complicated picture. That's all I can say. Yeah. And Syria, well, Syria is, in my view, very simple. Assad is whatever you say, is the legitimate president, authoritarian president, but legitimate president of Syria. His government was on the verge of collapse because there were rebels, including terrorists, acknowledged terrorists, who were threatening that government, who were threatening the city of Damascus. And he requested assistance, which was given him, military assistance from Russia, in relatively moderate amounts. And as a result, Assad is now the president of Syria. So yes, Russia had a hand in that. But secondly, there is currently an attempt to establish a political process of transition. And Russia has indicated that Russia does not regard the presidency of Assad as the precondition for that transition. So we don't know how that transition would end. I participated as an interpreter in a conference of various Syrian groups, opposition groups and other groups, discussing the transition. There is a process based in Geneva where different groups and the Syrian government participate in discussing this political transition. So perhaps something could be worked out. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yes, with regards to Gorbachev, number one, two-part question. Number one, how do the Russian people, particularly the young people, view him today in Russia? And two, how do you think the historians will regard his legacy? Will they consider him as one of the greatest Russian leaders in the last, say, 30, 40 years?
So far as young people are concerned, those young people who are interested in history, because frankly, this is history. I mean, for some young people, Gorbachev and Tsar Nicholas II are about in the same in the same category. But for many younger people who are really interested in the political process, in what happened, Gorbachev is a person of enormous interest, and they are frankly divided, just like their parents are divided. Some blame Gorbachev for the disappearance of the Soviet Union, even though, until the very end, Gorbachev called for preserving the country and for creating a union of sovereign republics, but nevertheless a union where defense, infrastructure, and other things would be of common concern. But many people are ignorant about that. Those people who are ignorant about that continue to blame him. So, as in any country, when something happens that is quite traumatic, and it was traumatic, the end of the country, as many people knew it, when this happens, the blame game begins. And obviously, particularly during the Yeltsin years, certainly the Yeltsin government didn't want to give the true picture of what had happened, because then it would be clear that Yeltsin was the person who actually signed the papers dissolving the Soviet Union. So they directly or indirectly blamed Gorbachev. But those young people and other people who are more knowledgeable about what really happened, I don't think they blame Gorbachev, and they also appreciate the freedoms and the rights that they acquired during the Gorbachev years. As I said, freedom of the press, freedom to speak out, freedom to associate, freedom of assembly, freedom to emigrate, freedom to travel, and being able to leave the country but also to return to the country. Millions of people are every year taking advantage of those freedoms. But unfortunately, many of them have forgotten that it was under Gorbachev that those freedoms started for the first time in centuries for the Russian people. So it's complicated. Your second question, I do hope that history, having established all those facts, will treat him very kindly. Yeah. Okay. Yes, young man.
Are people in Russia still concerned about Germany, considering that Germany's now risen to a prominent position on the European stage?
Frankly, I think that there we can now state there has been a reconciliation between Germany and Russia, between the people of Germany and Russia, and that was proven by the fact that the people of Russia and the people of the other peoples of the Soviet Union accepted the unification of Germany, and also you can judge it by other facts and signs, such as the fact that there are many Russians who travel to Germany. There's a good economic relationship between Russia and Germany. So I think that we may even recall the title of that treaty that was signed in 1990, the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany. There has been a final settlement. There has been a final reconciliation. Yes. Yes.
I'm Ukrainian, so I disagree with you on the view about Crimea.
Sure, sure.
Really, but it's my question about different things, because I know a lot of Russians who live in Russia.
So you disagree that there was a violation of international law when the Crimea incorporated?
Okay, I disagree about that Russians fight for Crimea during World War II because it was Ukrainians who fight for Crimea. I disagree that.
How come? It was Soviet troops, and the Soviet troops consisted. No. Come on. The Soviet troops consisted in about equal proportion of Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, more or less in proportion to the population. That's Timothy Snyder, the historian, who says that. He even says that the name, the First and Second Ukrainian Front, was because most of the Soviets who fought were Ukrainians. But that is just ridiculous. I mean, they were from all nationalities of the Soviet Union. No. And listen, what about the 19th century? The 19th century during the Crimean War. Who fought for? It was the Russian Imperial Army, consisting of Russians, Georgians, Ukrainians, and all the other, even Poles, and all the other, parts of the Russian Empire. I mean, it's over. The Russian Empire is over. The Soviet Union is over. Let's not argue about that. I admitted that the incorporation of the Crimea was the result of the violation of international law. I admitted that because I do not represent the Russian government. I'm free to speak my mind. Okay. Yes. So what's your question?
Yeah, it was good that you admitted.
Okay.
But you
Yeah.
represent, Gorbachev.
So what? I do not. I represent here. I represent just myself. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I want to notice one thing, that even I lived to the end of the Soviet Union in the Soviet Union. I never knew that Yeltsin signed those papers, because I feel like it's Gorbachev fault for break of Soviet Union. I mean, I'm not.
You didn't know about the meeting between Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich at Belovezhskaya Pushcha, where they signed those papers on the 5th of December, 1991. Google it. Google it if you don't know it.
Gorbachev fault for breaking of Soviet Union. I never associate Yeltsin with that.
How is that?
You need to advise more about it.
Well, as I said, some people just don't know the facts and they blame Gorbachev. That's why. Yeah. So what's your question?
Okay, my question, because when first Gorbachev and America went together, finish of Cold War,
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
so it was profitable kind of for Russia, because America gave a lot of money to Gorbachev for getting the missiles down. And
Not really. Not really.
I don't know the facts. I assume
You don't know the facts. That's right. No. Those agreements did not have any financials attached to them. There was no financial side to that agreement. It was the actual elimination of those weapons. You are right. It costs a lot of money, but we were responsible for it on our side, and the Americans were responsible on their side. By the way, I remember when we were discussing how to actually destroy those missiles, and there were hundreds of them on both sides. One of the ways that was discussed was that they would be destroyed by just launching them. And frankly, Americans didn't want it. But ultimately, ultimately, because this process is rather costly and launching is a lot less expensive, we agreed that 1/3 of those weapons would be destroyed by just launching them. So they're launched, and then they burn in outer space. That's it. Hmm? Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's correct. You don't want a nuclear weapon in outer space. Yeah.
Excuse me.
No. Finally, the question. Yes. Yes. What's the question?
It's just part of question. But my question now, America doesn't give that money to Russia. So what is the profit for Russian people to have relationship with America? Because among normal Russians, I don't see any interest in having relationship with America. I think it's more profitable for Russia not to have, like to have America like enemy number one than to have it a friend. Why?
Well, not really. I mean, if there is a really no, I can tell you, if there is really an arms race and a long-term confrontation between the United States and Russia, that would be really a very costly and a very dangerous situation. And I don't know who you talk to, but I talk to a lot of people in Moscow. I live in Moscow, and I can tell you, no one wants a long-term confrontation. No one wants, there are very few people who want a long-term confrontation with the United States. That's for sure.
Okay,
I can assure you. I mean, I live there. I live there. It's not just the upper class. It's not just the upper class. I think that there is a broad understanding among the Russian people, despite the current unpleasantness, that ultimately the two countries will have to come to terms. It's just difficult now because of the political situation, because of the accusations that we hear. But again, the trick, I think, is how Reagan did it. He separated, and Gorbachev too, he separated the issues into certain categories: arms control, bilateral relations, regional conflicts, human rights, global problems where we need to cooperate, and we took it step by step, step by step. I do not agree that there is no mutual interest in normalizing relations. These are still two very important countries, and normalizing relations between two still major powers it's obvious to me, it's in everyone's interest. Anyway, thanks.
I was going to ask one last question. I was going to ask him if he would mind taking a picture with everybody. If whoever wants to be in a picture, to come on up. We'll do a group photo.
Family photo. Okay.
A group photo. So if you guys want to come, anybody wants to come up, we'll do a group photo.